Ja, ich wünsche Ihnen erstmal einen wunderschönen guten Abend und freue mich, dass Sie trotz dieses fiesen Wetters es geschafft haben, zu uns zu kommen. Wir haben jetzt noch ein bisschen gewartet, weil einige Studierende anwesend sein werden und das mit dem CT ja immer so eine Sache ist. Also da wollten wir jetzt dann doch noch ein bisschen warten, aber ich begrüße Sie heute ganz herzlich im Namen der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor hier zur Arnheim Lecture. Liebe Damen und Herren, liebe Kooperationspartner und Partnerinnen und liebe Freunde der Stiftung. Es ist jetzt so ein bisschen zweisprachig. Ich habe heute Morgen erfahren, dass Herr Schuster, der eigentlich die Begrüßung als Vorstand der Stiftung hätte machen sollen, leider erkrankt ist und habe mich dann hingesetzt und meine Begrüßung auf Englisch geschrieben. Wir haben uns jetzt gerade geeinigt, dass wir heute doch eher zweisprachig bleiben. Ich also auf Deutsch sprechen darf und es dann, wenn Frau Professor Eninger vom Institut für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte übernimmt, dann auf Englisch weitergehen wird, dann Frau Pugh und auch Frau Christian noch Ihnen einiges sagen werden. Ich habe heute zu sagen, dass wir in einer langen, wirklich sehr langen Tradition stehen mit der Arnheim Lecture, die in diesem Haus tatsächlich seit dem Jahr 2000 stattfindet, also nunmehr über 20 Jahre und immer unterstützt wurde vom Deutschen Akademischen Austauschdienst, von der HU natürlich, die die Professur bei sich beherbergt, von uns und dann von der Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz der Berliner Museen, wo Herr Völlnagel heute auch unter uns ist, worüber ich mich sehr freue. Ich begrüße Frau Eninger, wie ich schon getan habe, Frau Christian und Frau Emily Pugh, die heute hier sprechen wird. Ich werde jetzt nicht weiter darauf eingehen, was wir heute hören werden, da uns Frau Christian dazu einiges sagen wird. Ich möchte nur betonen, dass Architektur auch immer etwas mit Emotionen zu tun hat, mit Erinnerungen, aufgeladen ist, mit Gefühlen, mit diversen Zuschreibungen, wie auch zum Beispiel expressionistischen Bauformen oder dem Wort Expressionismus an sich. Und da werden wir einiges zu hören. Wir befinden uns, dieses im Kopf behaltend, auch in einem Haus, das mit diversen Erinnerungen und Emotionen verbunden ist. Für diejenigen, die uns jetzt zum ersten Mal besuchen, möchte ich gerade in diesem Jahr dazu ganz kurz etwas sagen, da wir 90 Jahre jetzt zurückblicken müssen, muss man ja leider sagen, auf die Machtergreifung der Nationalsozialisten, die auch hier an diesem Platz und in diesem Haus besonders zur Kenntnis genommen wurde durch Max Liebermann, dessen Atelier sich hier befunden hat und dessen Wohnhaus dieses Haus war. Es ist gebaut worden 1844 von Schinkels Schüler August Stüler und es ist in dieser Hinsicht ein hochemotional aufgeladener Ort, denn es gehörte Max Liebermanns Familie annähernd 90 Jahre, als dieser, also Liebermann, aufhören musste zu arbeiten im Jahr 1933 und die Akademie der Bildenden Künste, die Preußische Akademie der Künste, deren Ehrenpräsident er war, verlassen musste, da die Nationalsozialisten im Frühjahr 1933 vor 90 Jahren an die Macht gekommen waren. 1935 starb er in diesem Haus. Seine Frau Martha wurde mit dem sogenannten Judenbann belegt, durfte hier nicht mehr leben und nahm sich dann 1943 vor genau 80 Jahren fast das Leben. Das Haus wurde kurz darauf zerbombt. Es war also dann dem Erdboden gleichgemacht 1943 und ist nach der Wiedervereinigung dann unter dem Stichwort Critical Reconstruction von Josef Paul Kleihues und seinen Architekten wieder aufgebaut worden von einem historischen Modell. wovon wir ja auch heute einiges hören wollen. Um die Atmosphäre der Architektur dieses Hauses und seiner Bewohner nachher noch etwas nachempfinden zu können, möchte ich Sie nach dem Vortrag herzlich einladen in den 3. Stock zu einem Getränk und zu ein paar Snacks. Und wir können dann dort mit Blick auf den Reichstag und das Brandenburger Tor, den wir als Inspirationsquelle betrachten dürfen, über die Lecture noch im Anschluss sprechen. Ich bedanke mich und freue mich auf den Vortrag. Ich übergebe hiermit an Frau Ehner.
Sehr geehrte Stiftungsmitglieder, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, liebe Studentinnen und Studenten, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Sie hören, dass mein Grußwort auch noch auf Deutsch formuliert ist. Der Sprachwechsel findet also erst mit Kathleen Christian statt, aber da Emily Pugh des Deutschen mächtig ist, fühle ich mich gar nicht schlecht dabei. Also erstmal möchte ich ganz herzlich Frau Buchinger in Vertretung für Herrn Schuster als Vorstand der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor für die freundlichen Worte zur Begrüßung danken. Als geschäftsführende Direktorin des Instituts für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte möchte auch ich Sie im Namen auch unserer weiteren Kooperationspartner der Stiftung Preußischer Kulturbesitz sowie des Deutschen Akademischen Austauschdienstes ganz herzlich zu dieser Arnheim-Lecture des Wintersemesters 2022/23 willkommen heißen. Und ganz besonders herzlich begrüße ich natürlich Emily Pugh, Principal Research Specialist for Digital Art History am Getty Research Center in Los Angeles, die derzeit unsere Arnheim-Gastprofessorin ist und Vortragende am heutigen Abend. Ich möchte der Stiftung Brandenburger Tor und namentlich eben Christine Buchinger noch mal ganz herzlich danken, dass wir an diesem besonderen Ort im Max-Liebermann-Haus unsere nun über 20 Jahre bestehende Tradition der Arnheim-Lecture fortführen dürfen. Ein Ort, der, wie Sie das schon ausgeführt haben, in besonderem Maße zu einer kritischen Reflexion der politischen Dimensionen von Kunst und Kultur auffordert. In den vergangenen 2 Jahrzehnten waren herausragende Künstlerinnen und WissenschaftlerInnen aus vielen Ländern, und ich zähle sie mal auf, vielleicht nicht vollständig, aber um Ihnen so ein bisschen die Internationalität dieses Programms vor Augen zu führen, bei uns zu Gast. Also Gäste aus Serbien, Ungarn, Polen, Rumänien, Frankreich, aus Israel, Indien, der Türkei, den Niederlanden, der Schweiz, England, Argentinien und aus den USA waren dank dieser Gastprofessur in Berlin zu Gast. Das ist natürlich eine unheimliche Spannbreite an unterschiedlichen Perspektiven und Blicken auf die Kunst und Kultur, die sich dadurch auch für unsere Studierenden geöffnet haben und die für uns immer eine riesige Bereicherung waren. Ermöglicht wird dies durch die Berliner Sparkasse, die die Stiftung Brandenburger Tor als Kulturstiftung gegründet hat und die Arnheim-Professur maßgeblich und mit äußerster Großzügigkeit fördert. Und dafür möchte ich im Namen unseres Instituts noch einmal meinen großen Dank aussprechen. Die Arnheim-Lecture bringt Stiftungs- und Institutsmitglieder und besonders unsere Studentinnen, Fachkolleginnen, aber auch Interessierte der breiteren Öffentlichkeit zusammen. Sie lädt zur Diskussion einer ganz großen Bandbreite aktueller Themen ein und vermittelt die Vielfalt kunst- und bildgeschichtlicher Forschung. Das zeigen Ihnen allein die Themen der letzten Vorträge, und ich zähle nur mal 3 auf, zum Beispiel Vorträge zum Feminismus und der Aktionskunst in der zeitgenössischen Kunst Lateinamerikas oder die Frage danach, was eine europäische Kunst sein kann und leisten muss, oder eben in diesem Jahr die Positionierung des Faches Kunstgeschichte im Feld der Digital Humanities. Und dieses Thema liegt dem IKB ganz besonders am Herzen, denn unser Institut ist schon lange an dem Verhältnis von neuen Technologien und Bildern interessiert, was beispielsweise die lange und intensive Arbeit in der Forschungsstelle Das technische Bild anzeigt oder auch die Entwicklung und Fortführung der Bilddatenbank Census, die von Kathleen Christian geleitet wird. Am Institut für Kunst- und Bildgeschichte öffnen sich mit der Arnheim-Gastprofessur neue Räume des wissenschaftlichen Austauschs und der Vernetzung. Wir sind jedes Semester aufs Neue begeistert davon, wie die Seminare unserer Gastprofessorinnen bei der Lehrplanung ins Programm aufgenommen werden können und wie die Studierenden sich darauf freuen und diesen internationalen Austausch mit den Wissenschaftlerinnen schätzen, weil sie eben deren Forschung und auch deren Lehre, deren Lehrformate persönlich kennenlernen können. Diese Begegnungen erschließen unseren Studierenden viele neue Wege für ihre eigenen inhaltlichen Schwerpunktsetzungen und auch für ihre professionelle Entwicklung. Das ist ein großer Gewinn für unser Institut, aber die Gastprofessur nimmt eben auch darüber hinaus eine ganz entscheidende Position in der Berliner Kulturlandschaft ein und sie stellt für alle Kooperationspartner eine große Bereicherung dar. Und damit freue ich mich nun auf den heutigen Vortrag von Emily Pugh und sie wird Ihnen von meiner Kollegin Kathleen Christian vorgestellt.
Thank you so much. I'm switching to English now, and it is my great pleasure to have Emily Pugh in the Institute as Rudolf Arnheim visiting professor for the winter semester. It's been such a pleasure to have you, and the students, I'm sure, have greatly appreciated your seminars in digital humanities and Berlin architecture, going out to Berlin with them and seeing things with new eyes. And we're just so pleased to have you and to hear your lecture tonight. Emily Pugh received her PhD from the SUNY Graduate Center in New York City, where she focused on both post-war architecture and digital humanities. In 2014, she published her monograph, Architecture, Politics, and Identity in Divided Berlin. This was a comparative analysis of selected works of architecture and urban planning in both East and West Berlin during the era of the Berlin Wall. And it revealed the importance of architecture in the formation of political, cultural, and social identities in both parts of the city, East and West. Wearing her other hat as a scholar of digital humanities, she has, since 2014, led the Digital Art History Department at the Getty Research Institute, which is widely considered to be the leading digital humanities center in the world, overseeing research activities of projects including Ed Rauscher, Streets of Los Angeles, and Phototech, a project focused on art historical photo archives. She's an expert on the digital media of art history and its related infrastructures, the digitization of physical materials, 3D scanning, computer vision, as well as collections and their metadata. At the moment, she's preparing a book manuscript, which is entitled The Modernist Mystique, Television and Public Taste in the U.S., 1950 to 1970. The title of her talk tonight brings together technology and architecture, as you'll see, her two hats that she wears, and is titled Scharoun, Saarinen, Gehry, Technology, Architecture, and Expressionism. Thank you.
Thank you for those generous introductions. It's such an honor to be here with you. And I want to begin by extending my thanks and appreciation to the Stiftung Brandenburger Tor, to Humboldt University, and my colleagues there, especially Eva and Kathleen, and to the TWA and other sponsors of the Arnheim Guest Professorship. It seems fitting to be delivering this lecture in this space, which was the site of an exhibition I co-curated with my colleague from the Getty Research Institute, Senior Curator for Architectural Collections, Maristella Casciato, along with colleagues from the Stiftung Brandenburger Tor. This exhibition, titled Frank Gehry, Scharoun, Strong Resonances, explored the relationships between these two architects, with a particular focus on projects here in Berlin. My experience working on this exhibition inspired a set of research questions related to the relationships between architecture and technology, by which I mean both technology as an idea and as a set of processes and tools. I became interested first in tracing a history of the role technological innovation has played in architects' development of new forms and approaches in the post-war period. And second, in how this aspect of architectural history has been alternately highlighted or ignored for reasons that have less to do with architecture than with political ideologies and national interests. The Expressionist movement in architecture formed a particularly interesting case study for me. Expressionism was, of course, a movement not only in architecture but in visual arts, including painting and film. It is closely associated with Germany and a brief period in the 1910s and 20s that was characterized by significant political turmoil, but also creative experimentation. Expressionist artists were responding to the social and cultural changes that had been unleashed by the rise of industrial production and the growth of the metropolis. In architecture, the movement is associated with exuberant, at times fantastical designs. These buildings, often executed in bright colors or using organic forms, were intended by their designers to serve as instruments of social cohesion, to counteract the splintering forces of modernity. As Expressionist architecture flourished against the backdrop of economic depression and the inflationary period of the early 1920s, however, many of these architects' designs remained relegated to paper and their imaginations. The reception of Expressionism by architectural historians in the 1930s and 40s was famously dismissive. Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, curators of the influential Modern Architecture International Exhibition held at New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1932, described Expressionist designs as overwrought and utopian, its practitioners indulging in arbitrary curves, zigzags, and fantastic decoration. This view was echoed by Swiss critic and art historian Siegfried Giedion, who, in his book Space, Time, and Architecture, originally published in 1941, declared that, quote, the Expressionist influence could not be a healthy one or perform any service for architecture. These interpretations of Expressionism cast long shadows into the post-war and helped to explain why the Expressionist movement and the architects associated with it received comparatively scant attention from historians and critics over the course of the 1940s and 50s and into the 1960s. And yet, despite their marginalization, the ideas and designs associated with Expressionism were not by any means, did not by any means remain relegated to the pre-World War II period. German architect Hans Scharoun was closely associated with the movement at its height, and his Berlin Philharmonie, now regarded as one of the most important Expressionist buildings, opened after the war in 1963. The work of Finnish-American architect Eero Saarinen likewise betrays an interest in the forms and concepts closely associated with Expressionism, as in his design for the TWA Terminal in New York clearly demonstrates. The work of Los Angeles-based architect Frank Gehry, born 1929, such as his Walt Disney Concert Hall, can also be placed within a historical lineage that includes Expressionist architecture. The connections evinced in these architects' work has been noted to some extent, both by architectural historians and, for example, by Frank Gehry himself, who cites Scharoun's Philharmonie as a specific influence on his design for Disney Hall. Yet most often, these three architects are discussed as more or less isolated figures, idiosyncratic designers who do not fit neatly into standard histories of modern architecture. I do not propose in one lecture to correct this oversight of architectural history, nor am I suggesting any kind of direct or simplistic historical trajectory from Scharoun to Gehry through Saarinen. While they share much in common, there are, of course, important differences in the work of these three architects. What I am proposing is that these three can serve as case studies, their work and its reception highlighting key blind spots within post-war architectural history, particularly those related to the historiography of Expressionism and the role of technology in contemporary architecture. Using Scharoun, Saarinen, and Gehry, I will trace a set of binary formulations, exploring how they have shaped our understanding of these architects and of the larger architectural cultures in which they worked, and in Gehry's case, still work. I will consider how these binaries have contributed to misapprehensions of Expressionism and its post-war influence, particularly in terms of how the search for novel forms has driven the use of construction technology, and in the case of Gehry and his contemporaries, digital design technologies. I will close by discussing how architects' use of innovative technologies has influenced the archival record of post-war architecture, and reflect on the challenges facing scholars who seek to write histories of architecture in the 21st century. I will begin with Hans Scharoun and with the idea of Expressionism as existing in contradistinction and even opposition to the idea of functionalism in architecture. The notion that Expressionism was utopian, irrational, and anti-functional was central to interpretations of the movement in the 30s, as we've seen. Even in 1967, Rainer Banham declared Expressionist architecture, quote, patently unbuildable. Hans Scharoun's Philharmonie, however, provides an example through which to explore the question, is that true? Are Expressionist designs unbuildable? And if so, how was the Philharmonie constructed? Is this building simply an anomaly, an exception that proves just how unbuildable most Expressionist architecture was? In fact, I would argue that Scharoun's Philharmonie is a building that both exemplifies key concerns of Expressionist architecture, carrying these into the post-war period, while it at the same time subverts standard interpretations of Expressionism as they existed in the 1960s. Scharoun was awarded the commission for the Philharmonie in 1956, and construction began on the building in September 1960. The Philharmonie was thus designed and constructed at a time when the West German building economy was still being reconstituted in the wake of the war. As scholar Manfred Pohl recounts in his history of the Philipp Holtzmann Construction Company, simple building techniques such as masonry construction and the use of elevators and buckets to haul cement on building sites persisted in Germany throughout the immediate post-war years. It was only in the late 1950s, that is, just when work was commencing on the Philharmonie, that modernization of West German construction was starting to reach a critical mass. Scharoun's building represents, thus, both the application of somewhat modest approaches to construction as well as more advanced, innovative ones. For example, the design and construction planning for the Philharmonie was carried out using traditional methods based in paper. Yet because of the complexity of the building's overall form, it became clear to the construction manager, Kurt Enderlein, that standard construction plans would not be sufficient as a guide to erecting the complex hall. Inspired by Scharoun's description of his design as a vineyard landscape, Enderlein devised a three-dimensional system for developing construction plans using geodesy, the science of accurately measuring and locating the Earth's geometric space and orientation in space, geometric shape, rather. As Enderlein later recounted, quote, using a three-axis coordinate system in which all the lines intersect at the site where the conductor would later stand, all the key points of the building parts could be calculated and spatially determined. In this way, the information is determined for the entire building and entered into a general plan, which is now the basis and starting point for detailed individual drawings, end quote. The use of these plans was augmented also with a physical model built at a scale of 1 to 9 that was accessible at the building site and served as a reference for the building's engineers and construction managers. Nothing's happening. There we go. While traditional approaches using paper-based drawings and physical models were used to translate the complex geometries of the Philharmonie design into buildable form, innovations in concrete technology helped make their construction possible. Reinforced concrete, mixed and poured on site, was relied upon, for example, to create the expansive interior volume of the concert hall itself. The ceiling of the concert hall is, in fact, 2 pre-stressed concrete shells with space between, suspended above the hall via 5 transport beams. The design for the ceiling represented a compromise between Scharoun's design and the acoustical requirements worked out by the project's acoustician, Lothar Kramer. The solution was devised by structural engineer Werner Köpke, working with Berthold Neunert from the Duvidag Construction Works. While reinforced concrete was not itself a new technology, among the techniques used for the Philharmonie was post-tensioned concrete, an approach to pre-stressing concrete after it is cast. Post-tensioning concrete was still a relative novelty in the early 1960s. Also new was the use of construction cranes on the building site to transport hoppers of wet concrete and other building supplies. The Philharmonie clearly demonstrated that expressionist buildings could be built. Yet the example also illustrates that it was not only these buildings' complex forms or lack of advanced building technology that presented challenges to their construction. To erect the Philharmonie, and to do so in the span of just 3 years, required both innovation in terms of structural engineering and a considerable outlay of financial resources. The willingness to expend such resources expanded considerably after the closure of Berlin's border in 1961 and the subsequent construction of the Berlin Wall, and was a critical factor in the realization of the building. Its cost was initially estimated at 7 million Deutschmarks, and Scharoun was admonished to stay close to that amount. By the end, however, the total cost was allowed to increase by a factor of 2.5, eventually topping out at 17.5 million Deutschmarks. The effort and expense afforded Scharoun's building yielded the desired effect. The Philharmonie opened in October 1963 to wide acclaim from both the architectural community and the wider public. The concert hall's interior was in particular praised, both for its beauty and formal inventiveness, and for the sense of interconnectedness and community it engendered in the audience and performers. From an architectural point of view, wrote critic Jürgen Jödecke, everything in this room has succeeded. Speaking of the non-hierarchical vineyard-style seating arrangement, Jödecke commented, "The individual does not become subsumed within a crowd of spectators, but rather finds himself in a small, manageable section, which, in turn, is in a legible and clearly recognizable relationship with other sections. Is this, one might ask, the place of democracy, where the individual stands in freedom with an articulated community?" German architect Frei Otto declared enthusiastically in the Deutsche Bauzeitung, "Scharoun designed a unique building for a special orchestra that is without comparison." Julius Posener agreed, writing an architectural review that what Scharoun says about the intimate character of the vast room and of the close and active relation between producer and consumer is completely vindicated in the finished auditorium. The building remains Scharoun's most well-known and highly praised work. One might think that its success would perhaps mark a new chapter in the reception and interpretation of Expressionism. Scharoun's hall had provided ample evidence that Expressionist designs were possible to build, even if they required substantial resources to realize. Furthermore, the building proved that Expressionist buildings could serve as effective and embraced cultural symbols, a particularly valuable quality in the context of the early Cold War. Yet, just a few years after its opening, the first post-war histories of Expressionism would reaffirm the early interpretation of it as a short-lived side branch from the main trunk of modernism. British historian Dennis Sharp described it in his 1966 book, Modern Architecture and Expressionism, as a trend that had ultimately failed to develop, in large part because it was too difficult to carry out. In 1967, Rainer Banham would write in his review of Sharp's book that Expressionism had, quote, come to rank as a sinister aberration that had to be trampled down whenever it appeared. As historian Rosemarie Haig-Bletter would later write, this 1960s revival of the movement at once resurrected Expressionism and, quote, consigned it to a new grave. Even in the largely positive appraisals of the Philharmonie, it is clear that critics found it difficult to place the building within then current conceptions of modern architecture. The building was written about both as the last gasp of a pre-war movement and as a building very much of its time. Julius Posener called it of its day, but also wrote, quote, it has been said that Scharoun uses a language no longer of our own, the language of Expressionism. Ultimately, Posner concluded that in the Philharmonie, the architect uses two languages, that of expressionism for the main shapes and that of industry for the details, and the two do not seem to fit together. His assessment reflects a post-war architectural discourse, by then pervasive in Western Europe and especially in the United States, that understood modernism in strict terms of either expressionism or functionalism. Architects, that is, were defined as belonging to one of these two categories, which were furthermore understood as discrete and mutually exclusive. This binary framework likewise presented a challenge to critics, who, for example, grappled with whether Scharoun's Philharmonie could be considered functional. Jodocke wrote that Scharoun had, quote, deepened the concept of function beyond its rational aspects, while Otto declared it anything but functional architecture in the conventional sense. Indeed, while some critics mentioned some aspects of the Philharmonie's construction, neither the details of how it was engineered nor the technologies that, for example, made its expansive interior possible were a significant or consistent focus of its analysis. Scharoun's association with Expressionism seemed to make it difficult for critics to address the role technology played in the realization of his building. The reception of the Philharmonie stands in sharp contrast to that of the new National Gallery, designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, which opened across the street from the Philharmonie in 1968. Mies's building was explicitly praised in, for example, the American magazine Architectural Forum as a, quote, spectacular achievement in architecture, urban planning, and in technology. This judgment was based in part on the means by which it was engineered and constructed. For example, as proof that it was a technological marvel, critic Peter Blake cited the building's steel roof, prefabricated, weighing 1,250 tons, measuring 215 feet square, and raised hydraulically to a clear height of 28 feet in a mere 8 hours and 57 minutes. Scharoun's building was, of course, also a marvel of engineering. However, the new National Gallery arguably corresponded more closely to critics' image of technology as expressed through steel, glass, and the exposure or seeming exposure of a building's structure and tectonics. Indeed, critics often describe Mies and Scharoun as working in two radically different architectural idioms. In his review of the Philharmonie, Otto described them as extreme opposites, writing, quote, Scharoun is an exponent of Romanticism in the 20th century, is representative of a feeling world. Mies, on the other hand, is an exponent of the straightforwardness of thinking, precise statements, and scientific character. To be sure, critics throughout this period debated the validity of the divide between Expressionism and functionalism. In 1962, leaders of the architectural establishment in the US gathered at Columbia University explicitly to discuss the, quote, origin and applicability of the terms functionalism and expressionism. Yet, such efforts did not so much resolve these binaries as they further entrenched them. Regardless, the view that Scharoun's building fell on the expressionist side of the divide was undoubtedly a factor in its reception, particularly in the US, where his work was essentially ignored throughout the 1960s and 70s. While Mies's new National Gallery made the cover of Architectural Forum in 1968, the Philharmonie was not even reviewed in the publication. Neither was it reviewed in the American journal Architectural Record. Scharoun's death was mentioned in a brief 45-word obituary in Architectural Forum in 1973. In a turn of phrase that reflects the continuing influence of the expressionist functional divide, the obituary describes the architect as having, quote, had an aversion to the box. The example of Scharoun's Philharmonie and its reception demonstrates the tensions that existed between the use of construction technology and critics' perception of it in Western Europe and the US. Scharoun's use of asymmetrical forms, his direct connection to the pre-war expressionist movement, his interest in the psychological effects of his buildings, these were all aspects of his architecture that ensured it was perceived to varying extents as or anti-technological. The work of Eero Saarinen in the post-war US, on the other hand, would seem to resolve these tensions, as it featured both curvilinear organic forms and the clear expression of tectonics. However, Saarinen's architectural reception was defined by yet another binary, one which was connected to the expressionist-functionalist dichotomy, but which was particular to the United States, the binary of avant-garde versus kitsch. Saarinen established a successful practice in the United States in the 1950s, executing major commissions for American corporations such as General Motors, IBM, the CBS television network, and Trans World Airlines, or TWA. Saarinen continually sought out new materials and cutting-edge technologies in an effort to create novel forms and innovative design solutions that were specific to each project. For perhaps his most famous work, the TWA Terminal at Idlewild Airport, now John F. Kennedy Airport, in New York, which opened in 1962, Saarinen designed a sculptural building made of swooping arcs of reinforced concrete. Similar to Scharoun's Philharmonie, the production of plans to guide the construction of the building's complex forms was a challenge, necessitating the use of three-dimensional models. The reinforced concrete buttresses, which supported the 6,000-ton roof, were shaped first and wired in cardboard models before being translated into drawings. These were not conventional drawings, however. Traditional construction drawings would not have provided the necessary dimensional information to the managers on the job site. Rather, these drawings were contour maps that showed the building's major elements in cross-section. Hundreds of such drawings were produced, requiring over 5,000 hours of draftsmanship. Technological innovation in Saarinen's building was not confined to their construction. For TWA and for his design for Dulles Airport, which opened outside of Washington, D.C., also in 1962, Saarinen devised innovative methods for tackling the challenges presented by commercial jet travel. The larger jet planes meant more passengers, more baggage, and larger-scale terminals. At TWA, his team pioneered the use of a remotely controlled data board for displaying up-to-date flight arrival and departure times, as well as a mechanized luggage return carousel. For Dulles Airport, to replace the long, narrow terminals which required travelers to walk long distances, Saarinen designed mobile lounges to carry passengers back and forth from terminals to planes. Saarinen sought not only to fulfill the functional requirements of a given project, but to create with his building cultural symbols that would have an emotional and psychological impact on their users. Describing his approach to designing the TWA terminal, for example, Saarinen said he wanted to, Saarinen said he wanted to not only serve the needs of the airline, but to encourage passengers to, quote, catch the excitement of the trip. Part of how he achieved this was through the use of tectonics as expressive form. At TWA, the reinforced concrete shell is left virtually bare, allowing it to serve as the building's primary aesthetic component. On the exterior, its load-bearing function is on display in, for example, the comparatively small wedge-shaped supports that flank the terminal's entrance. On the interiors, the vaulted ceilings allow for visually stunning open expanses, through which passengers are guided by carefully designed successions of railings, staircases, and lighting features, in a strategy similar to that used by Scharoun in the Philharmonie. Indeed, Saarinen's architecture demonstrates that the approaches employed by Scharoun in the Philharmonie and by Mies at the New National Gallery were less oppositional extremes than they were complementary threads that formed part of the same modernist cloth. Saarinen's architecture, I would argue, reveals the extent to which the values and goals of Expressionism had not only extended into the post-war period, but continued to flourish and evolve. Expressionism, that is, should by no means be thought of as a stunted side growth, but at the root of modern architecture. formed in the crucible of political unrest, economic downturn, and aesthetic experimentation in Germany and elsewhere in the 1910s and 20s, Expressionist ideas and forms exerted an indelible influence on the architects who engaged with them. This diverse group included Scharoun, but also Walter Gropius, and yes, Mies, although both Gropius and Mies later sought to excise their Expressionist periods from their biographies. It must also be mentioned that Expressionist ideas informed the architectural spectacles conceived of by the Nazi regime, as historian Kathleen James Chakraborty and others have noted. Certainly, this connection to fascism was a decisive factor shaping the reception of Expressionism in the decades following World War II. It certainly undergirds the reception of Saarinen's architecture within the architectural establishment of the US and Western Europe, which was decidedly mixed. While some of his projects, including the General Motors Technical Center, were praised, others were intensely criticized in the architectural press. His terminal for TWA in particular was praised and lambasted. While the critic for Architectural Forum lauded the, quote, spatial and sculptural sensations of this truly fantastic work, others accused Saarinen of creating a building that was all shallow aesthetics and styling, designed above all, in the words of Rainer Banham, to, quote, bestow status and improve the image of its corporate client. Critic Alan Cahoon compared it unfavorably to, quote, dematerialized and unearthly forms of an expressionist film set. Pseudo-concrete choked with steel was how historian Vincent Scully described the TWA terminal in his 1969 book, American Architecture and Urbanism, dismissing it as a collection of, quote, a few calculated features designed for mass appeal. For these critics, this was not architecture, but advertising. As architectural historian Alice Friedman has recently argued, the TWA terminal was a, quote, lightning rod for contemporary tensions, only some of which had to do with architecture. The extreme negative reaction to Saarinen's architecture, that is, had much to do with political ideology and Cold War anxieties. Specifically, this reaction reflected American critics' deep suspicion of any attempts to move people emotionally or psychologically en masse. Such art, American critics often argued, could only be considered kitsch. Kitsch stood in opposition, of course, to the avant-garde, as part of a formulation first offered by art critic Clement Greenberg in his 1939 essay, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. Kitsch, according to Greenberg, was defined as, quote, the debased and academicized simulacra of genuine culture, and associated with fascist and socialist regimes. Alternatively, the avant-garde for Greenberg signified pure and authentic culture, the expression of an absolute in which all relativities and contradictions would be either resolved or beside the point. The avant-garde, that is, constituted high art, in contrast to the low art of kitsch. There is not time here to fully explore the context or influence of Greenberg's essay on American post-war criticism. What is important in connection with the discussion of Expressionism is that the idea that artistic production could be divided into one of two camps, avant-garde or kitsch, further reinforced the existing binary conceptions within the discourse on modern architecture. Furthermore, the avant-garde kitsch dichotomy helped to ensure an architectural discourse that was fundamentally shaped by the politics of the Cold War. As art historian Susan Noyes-Platt argues, Greenberg's critical framework with its, quote, facile antithesis of good and bad, avant-garde and kitsch, acceptable and unacceptable, in or out, suited the Cold War era when good and bad seemed easily differentiated, unquote. Certainly, the avant-garde kitsch distinction informed architectural critiques like those of Saarinen. It is not by chance, for example, that Scully explicitly invokes fascism in his assessment of the architect, comparing the mobile lounges Saarinen designed for Dulles Airport to the troop carriers used by the Nazis' Afrika Korps. To Scully and other critics, Saarinen's architecture was mere kitsch. It represented the debasement of the principles of modern architecture as they were then defined. This was not avant-garde rational form or honest tectonics, but deceitful surface detailing and, quote, pseudo-concrete exhibitionism and structural pretension. One result of the critical framework that the avant-garde kitsch formulation reinforced was that the continuities between modern architecture as it developed in the pre- and post-war period were occluded. This was not necessarily a conscious or intentional aim of such criticism, I would argue, but rather a consequence of the underlying assumption within the architectural establishment that modern architecture was fundamentally progressive and thus could not exist within fascism or socialism. Regardless, the end result was a critique that served to foreground particular facets of pre-war architecture and to marginalize or even suppress others. Many historical and geographical continuities were likewise forgotten or ignored. In the later 1960s and 70s, for example, the prevailing understanding of modern architecture as fundamentally Western and capitalist helped shape its critique by alternative architectural movements. As architects and community activists pushed back against urban planning politics based on modernist principles like the 1933 Charter of Athens, they sought alternatives to such approaches. In many cases, they turned to ideas and themes that were in fact part of pre-war modern architectural thought, such as the exploration of environmental psychology and the concept of advocacy planning, in which architects collaborate with users to design their spaces. Such ideas were linked with the far left elements of pre-war modernism, with figures like Hannes Meyer, and partly as a result, many of these ideas were left out of post-war architectural histories published in the West. Thus, when they were embraced, for example, by figures like Gustav Hamer or the members of the West Berlin squatters movement, ideas like advocacy planning were perceived and presented as anti-modernist. The expressionist label was defined in vague and contradictory terms and was often arbitrarily applied. It also served the overwhelmingly formal approach to architectural criticism that dominated in the post-war period. In other words, buildings like Scharoun's Philharmonie and Mise's New National Gallery were perceived as representing opposites, in part because that is how they looked. Books such as those by Itohan Osiemweze and Lucas Stanek have begun to address the historical lacunae that have resulted from such formal analysis in books that investigate understudied aspects of architectural history, such as the influence of building and construction companies on the evolution of modernism and global networks of labor and architectural expertise. Books like these serve to mitigate the influence of dualities like expressionist, functionalist, and avant-garde kitsch. There is yet another duality that has been fueled by style-oriented histories of modernism. Within this discourse, which understands architecture to a large extent as art and the architect as artist, technology is often understood as separate from architecture, a supplement or tool. Digital technologies in particular are discussed as existing outside of architecture, representing a force that exerts pressure on or even threatens to take over it. What is sometimes referred to in shorthand as the digital is furthermore discussed as if in opposition to material forms of information, with the presumption that digital processes replace or obviate the need for those based in paper or pen. Yet, as the examples of Saarinen and Scharoun have already demonstrated, architects' buildings have long been fundamentally shaped in multiple ways by the various technologies used to design and realize them. Architectural evolution was throughout the 20th century deeply interconnected with developments in engineering, design, and even media technologies. The complexity of this relationship between digital and material forms of architectural information is evident in the work of another architect who has been called an expressionist, Frank Gehry. Considering Gehry as part of a shared historical lineage along with Scharoun and Saarinen, it becomes clear that the history of modern and contemporary architecture is to a large extent a history of technology. Frank Gehry is, of course, an architect known both for the complex forms of his buildings and for his use of 3D design software CATIA in designing and constructing them. It was in the late 1980s that Gehry began using CATIA, a software application used for 3D surface modeling that was developed for the aerospace industry. According to Gehry, in 1989, when the Vitre Design Museum in Weil am Rhein was nearing completion, he was annoyed to discover a kink in the building's swooping exterior staircase that should not have been there. Calculations and plans were double-checked, but the source of the problem could not be found. A colleague of Gehry's suggested CATIA as a means for preventing future miscalculations. The use of CATIA would ultimately reshape Gehry's formal idiom, as well as the design processes employed within his practice. The role of CATIA's use in the evolution of Gehry's practice is apparent in the designs for the Peter Lewis House, which he worked on from 1989 to 1995, but which was never built, for the Guggenheim in Bilbao, which opened in 1997, and for the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles, which opened in 2003. Gehry's use of CATIA in many ways represents a further evolution in the design processes and practices employed by Hans Scharoun and Eero Saarinen. As the examples of the Philharmonie and TWA Terminal demonstrate, architectural designs that were complex, both in terms of their forms and construction, required advanced technologies to realize. As we've seen, architects and engineers on these projects deployed innovative means for translating two-dimensional designs into usable construction plans, based in particular on the use of 3D models. Over time, processes of translating designs from 2 to 3 dimensions relied increasingly on automation, because automated processes produced more reliable and precise results and did so more quickly. Automation also reduced costs, thus obviating the need for the extraordinary political will and expense required to build, for example, Scharoun's Philharmonie. Already in the TWA project, Saarinen's team used computers to calculate the measurements for the angles of curvature to build the concrete ribs and beams of the building's roof. CATIA served the same function in relation to Frank Gehry's designs. Using CATIA, Gehry's team translated physical models into digital design files. For Disney Hall, this process of translation from physical to digital consisted of literally chasing a stylus over physical models to produce CATIA files that captured their complex geometry. The CATIA models, then as now, were translated back into physical models for further design and refinement by Gehry's team before being converted into a digital format once again. As this process demonstrates, the Gehry's office's use of CATIA did not by any means represent a replacement of the use of physical models or material forms of design. On the contrary, the introduction of CATIA to the design workflow fueled an incredible explosion of material production. With the ability offered CATIA to translate highly complex forms into built structure, Gehry and his team were able to create even more elaborate physical models using an even more diverse range of materials, from paper to plastic to cardboard to clay. Gehry's team even bought bolts of cloth to create undulating forms, which, thanks to CATIA, could be translated into design specifications. As you can see here, 2 of the first CATIA projects, the Bilbao Guggenheim and Peter Lewis House, generated an enormous trove of physical models and other material artifacts. While the use of CATIA does not alone explain the incredible numbers of models that were created for these projects, it should nonetheless be regarded as an important factor driving material production in Gehry's firm. Considering Gehry's use of CATIA as part of a longer historical lineage helps foreground the extent to which computing technologies developed over time and in tandem with architecture. The work of designers who were interested in the relationships between visual design, communication, and media and information theory, figures such as Cedric Price, Christopher Alexander, and Elliot Noyes, further illustrates the extent to which the worlds of architecture, design, and computer science have long been intertwined. Moreover, interest across these fields has flowed in both directions. As Molly Steenson notes in her book, Architectural Intelligence, How Designers and Architects Created the Digital Landscape, quote, just as architects turned to computers, In the 1960s, computation, cybernetics, and AI researchers turned towards architecture. Far from an external force, digital technologies have been embedded within architecture for decades. The history of 20th century architecture is inevitably also a history of technological processes and tools of communication, design, and construction, even as it is also a history of form. For all three architects, the creation of boundary-pushing complex buildings necessitated the production of material forms of information, in particular thousands of drawings and many, many physical models, as well as digital design files in the case of Gehry. The question of how we write histories of architecture that avoid but also dismantle the binary conceptions of the past is therefore inevitably tied up with questions related to archive and evidence. What traces of the technological processes in which architects like Scharoun, Saarinen, and Gehry worked and work are contained within their archives? And how do we understand and interpret them? It can be quite difficult to write histories of design and construction technologies because many of the materials that would help tell that story do not end up in archives. Models, so critical to all three of these architects' work, are expensive to store and provide access to. Many architectural archives, quite understandably, explicitly do not acquire models. As a result, one must look for other kinds of materials that can provide insight into such questions. A valuable source for my ongoing research into the Philharmonie's construction has been a documentary film that features copious footage of the building site from 1960 to 1963. When one enters the realm of automation, however, a different problem arises. The challenge with regard to Gehry's archive is not a lack of information, but its superabundance. This fact is readily apparent when one considers the Frank Gehry papers, the archive of Gehry's early work acquired by the Getty Research Institute, or GRI, in 2017. The Gehry papers represents about 280 projects designed between 1954 and 1988, along with a select few projects that were completed after 1988, including the Disney Concert Hall. The GRI's archivists and conservators are still preparing the Gehry archive for public access, a process that was delayed by the pandemic but is slated to be completed in 2024. Rough estimates of its contents include 2,385 tubes and boxes of rolled drawings, 1,307 banker's boxes of correspondence and other documents, photos, samples, and similar materials, around 110,000 slides, 500 physical models, 104 gigabytes of images, and 90 gigabytes of project-related files, for a total of about 194 gigabytes of born digital material comprising over 100,000 files. To understand how large this collection is, it's perhaps helpful to compare it with the GRI's largest acquisition prior to the Gehry archive, that of Swiss contemporary art curator Harald Seemann. The Seemann papers total about 2,000 linear feet, or 610 meters. In comparison, the Gehry papers surpassed the linear mile mark, that is about 5,280 feet, or 1,610 meters, a year ago, and there's still 2 years left to go in processing. The vast scale of Gehry's archives underscores the challenges ahead for scholars writing architectural history in the 21st century. Navigating the complex ecosystem of digital and material information that comprises archives like Gehry's will increasingly be a requirement for all scholars of architecture. The example of the Gehry papers challenges, but more importantly, complicates the notion that digital or data-based forms of information exist either in opposition to or in isolation from physical or material forms. Navigating this large and hybrid archive necessitates an exploration of how these various formats of information relate to one another. Indeed, using archives like Gehry's necessitates understanding their physical and digital artifacts as all part of multiple and intersecting processes of design, construction, promotion, but also of archival description and data generation. Viewed backward through the work of Frank Gehry, it's difficult to view Expressionism in architecture as entirely irrational, anti-functional, or anti-technological. While it will take me further research to unpack the complex relationships between Expressionism, architecture, and technology, I hope the examples of Scharoun, Saarinen, and Gehry have at least complicated the standard narratives of these concepts and their relationships to design. At the very least, it should be clear that Expressionism has served throughout the 20th century as a kind of critical boogeyman, an appellation at once vague and precise, the use of which was driven as much by cultural politics as by architectural discernment. The term, for me, represents a kind of prism through which to view histories of modernism in the 20th century. When the term expressionism has been used, how, in relation to which architects and buildings, all of this provides insight into how architectural modernism has been understood as well as misunderstood. In particular, through the work of these three architects, one can see how the term expressionism has enlightened but also obscured continuities, such as those apparent in their work. In fact, Scharoun, Saarinen, and Gehry are all part of a shared historical lineage, one grounded to a large extent in the use of advanced technologies. Accounting for this reality is particularly important in the contemporary age, as the impact of technology on architecture is felt also by scholars. Architects' practices, of course, shape the composition, size, and scale of their archives, in turn influencing the kinds of research questions that can be asked or investigated with them. As we consider how we might foreground forgotten or ignored historical and geographic continuities, we will also have to consider the past and future of architectural technologies and the ways they affect us as historians, scholars, and as users of buildings. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Emily. That was just incredibly rich and so full of so many different layers and so wonderfully bringing together what you do as an architectural historian and as a digital art historian in a very complex way that I'm sort of still kind of reeling the implications of what you were saying. And I guess maybe one question from my perspective as someone who is not dealing with the history of architecture, but was really fascinated by the connections you were making. So how much is this technology itself kind of an aesthetic? And how much is it real? How much is it kind of, actually a result of using technology and awareness of technology, and how much of it is a kind of ambition? We might ask that also about digital humanities as well. Like how much of it is a kind of, think about the space program and the aesthetic of the space program.
Absolutely, yeah.
And this kind of Stanley Kubrick movies, this kind of fascinating aesthetic of technology that is part fiction, part reality. And so I was just wondering how, how much of it is an aesthetic issue and how much of it is a technological issue. Mm-hmm. And also when technology is used in Berlin in the 1960s, where is it coming from? What international kind of connections are being made by making statements about moving forward with technology? So this is, I guess, how is Berlin speaking to the world when it's making use of expressionism? So, and making use of new technologies that weren't available before. So I guess that would be my initial question, and of course there are many, many more coming. So,
well, I'll start with your first question. I mean, I think that really is the question for me, and one I think to a large extent, the idea of technology as sort of symbol or idea, and the sort of nuts and bolts reality of which technologies were used and how, and the interaction between, what has driven the development of technologies also which ones, the mobile lounges, as we were talking about before, didn't really work that well and went away. So some technologies, they kind of, great ideas, but they die out or don't work or what have you. And I think that's precisely the kind of thing that I'm interested in investigating in this project, is to really not to speak about technology as an important symbol as it was, but also to kind of tie that discourse with more sort of concrete information, no pun intended, about how these buildings actually were built and using which technologies, which is actually, in many cases, difficult to uncover. I mean, which leads to your second question, which I think to some extent, people have said that in Berlin you could build an expressionist building, which you couldn't elsewhere, but then other people, I think it's complicated. But in terms of like how it was built, it's the Philharmonie, that is, like what specifically it was built. That's been very difficult to research. I think part of that, what makes that difficult too, is you hear all the names. We talk about these individual architects, but there are, in the case of the Philharmonie, there's the acoustician, there's the concrete works, there's the, architects who, because of this formalist history of architecture where we tend to think of architects as the sole authors, it means that we sometimes forget this broader, more complex picture, and that, either some of that material is found in the archives of the other people, but it may be that those people don't even have archives that people considered worth keeping. So that's why I think the question of archive becomes really important to this project as well.
Absolutely. So we have a microphone that we will pass around for questions. If anyone would like to ask a question of Emily, and also, yes, in the back there.
Thank you very much for your talk. I have a rather maybe simple question, maybe not. What role do the photographs of the building play? Because as you showed the photograph of Mies van der Rohe, then it's apparent how well his architecture is captured by one photograph. And those buildings we see now, there are certain views that work very well, but I imagine some views don't work very well, and it's difficult to capture the, essence, the style, the architecture in one image. So how does this translation into a representation work? And what role does it play for the reception of this type of architecture?
Thank you for that question. That's critically important, and that's the big technology I did not address here explicitly. But part of this formalist history of architecture has been the primacy placed on these images by scholars, but also by the architects themselves, who start hiring photographers. Obviously, photographs are easier to acquire as an archive than models, so that's what ends up in the archives. Also, we're talking about in the post-war a period of the explosion of mass media, and in some cases, in a case like a building like the Philharmonie and then Bilbao later, those buildings are not only made for the audience of local people or people who will visit those buildings, they're made for the broader audience of people who may only see them in magazines. So that's definitely something I've explored in other things I've written about how these buildings are imaged, the fact that Mies's buildings do translate into two dimensions, generally speaking, better than Expressionist buildings, with maybe the exception of the interior of the concert hall, which actually does. I mean, it's hard to take a bad picture of it, honestly, which may account for part of its, positive reception, I think. But yeah, no, absolutely. The photography is a really important part of this story, as are things like television. And things like, in the case of more recent, like 3D, and the potential of being able to reproduce these buildings in ways other than two dimensions, especially since, as you've seen, were designed through models and three-dimensional forms of representation. So, yeah, it's a big question, but I'm glad you raised it. Thank you so much. It's a good one.
Do you have a question here?
Emily, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. There's a lot of literature about expressionist architecture, and you are right of focusing on the technological side. But is there not, from Mendelssohn to Scharoun and Saarinen and Gehry, one common practice, which is drawing? So technology at a certain moment takes command in this process, but the basis of all of them is still drawing, and they continue. I mean, Frank cannot live without drawing all the time, and then technology comes in and makes it possible to convert these drawings into a kind of living architecture. Mm-hmm. But without this first idea, I mean, technology realized what he has drafted, but he never started with the technology. Is that right?
I would say that it's maybe a more, well, I think it totally depends on the architect, for sure. And yes, drawing is important for all three of these architects and for Mendelssohn. I think it's less of a straight line from drawing to, say, digital, that it's more of a cyclical practice where drawing becomes model, becomes digital design, goes back to being a physical model. They may draw directly on the model, et cetera. So I think it's not, first of all, this sort of, I wouldn't say, especially with Frank Gehry, it's not a sort of one-directional thing. And it's also, I think, how the material and digital forms work together or are in conversation with one another. And I think with Frank Gehry in particular, that's a really important conversation. And how, but each of them, I think, for each of these architects, the role that technology plays and how it influences their design thinking, and which media is the most sort of inspiring for them in their process is slightly different. So it's, I think, important to remember.
Okay, is it Stefano de Bosio?
Yes, thank you very much for this very rich talk. I was somehow fascinated by what I would call the holistic dimension and also promise of technology, in the sense that we have this, I had this impression that technology somehow allows to reach something that is out of the possibility of the architect and, for example, also of his drawing practice somehow. And the similar is now with this perspective that technology offers of digitalizing these archives, mm-hmm. and inquiring them according to principles and practices that are almost impossible to devise, I mean, in let's say, in an analogical way. For example, all the possibility of a critique de variante, that looking at the gigabytes of Gehry's project will allow. So I was wondering, what would a sort of holistic history of architecture look like? Because also listening to you, I had the perception of different also tracks. Mm-hmm. I mean, that of the history of architecture, aesthetic history of architecture, and this history of technology that somehow you were very, I would say, very powerful in showing how the history of technology somehow unpacks some of the ideological premises embedded in the aesthetic history somehow of architecture, showing also similarities, mm-hmm. that are not aesthetics but technological. For example, in these two buildings of Van der Rohe and Scharoun that face each other. I mean, mm-hmm. So this was my question also. This, what bringing all this material into the history of architecture can mm-hmm. What does it mean? Thank you so much.
I mean, I think this is something I struggled with writing this, because I think, you know, Thomas, maybe you were hinting at this. Some of what I'm saying about the reception of Expressionism is well known. I think the missing part is it's known, but I'm not sure it's examined or that we've really responded to the reality of it. And so, partly I'm reasserting the role of technology in that movement or in the ideas that are associated with it as a way of complicating our idea. But I think one thing that becomes hard when you want to critique a history is what takes its place. Because one of the reasons these ideas have remained so ingrained, I think, is because there hasn't been a paradigm introduced to replace it. And I'm, I guess, a little reticent myself. I don't want to replace one grand narrative with another, let's say. That having been said, I think the idea of technology is one that is so multivaried. We're talking about a lot of different kinds of technology. We're talking about technology as an idea and very specific technologies. We're also talking about, as we've said, the different role these various technologies can play in these individual architects' work. So I think part of what is useful for me in thinking through these things via technology is to really think about it less as this thing that's kind of butting up against architecture, but that's woven into it. And if approaching these architects' work and approaching a movement like Expressionism through the lens of technology helps me see things that I have found difficult to see in other ways. And it also, I think, for me, helps me in thinking about not just the history of architecture, the production of architecture, but the writing of architectural history as navigating what is this vast ecosystem that includes technology and technological infrastructures. Already it did before the computer, but now even more so, as I tried to show at the end there with the Frank Gehry, the Frank Gehry archives, that this ecosystem that, for example, Frank Gehry is tapping into to create his works, it continues in the archive, and I participate in it when I'm engaging with this archive, because I, to some extent, have to use technological means to access those materials, physical and digital. So for me, I guess, I don't know if this is an answer to your question, but for me, technology is a seemingly simplistic thing that actually opens this up for me to see things that I think are less apparent otherwise.
Okay, Mateusz Kapuska?
Thank you very much for your lecture. You devoted the very last words of your talk to the users of the buildings. And following this, my question concerns the connection between form and function. Mm-hmm. To put this in a way, does form follow function? It would be, of course, a provocative question, but I was myself provoked somehow by Saarinen himself, who told us about, he didn't want to superimpose the architecture, but rather to address the expectations of its users. And what is striking, and in the examples he showed us, is that there's something like a common denominator in terms of all you can do in those buildings is something like a fictitious level of shared experience. All people visiting the buildings, the users of the buildings, are doing the same. Either they are, just looking at images or sculptures, paintings, or visiting or hearing music, or going here and there, running through the non-site of the airport. So there's kind of something like a sublation of individuality, Aufhebung, so to say. Yeah. And I would be interested in how far in those discourses you quoted, and according to your view, in how far the form, which you called expressionism in terms of genealogy, with form reinstitutes or readdresses or even maybe compensates this leveling of individuality and readdresses it, because it's not about the architects, it's about the users who are the same, but they are going to reinvent their own feeling in the space of this shared experience. Thank you.
I mean, I think that's obviously a key interest of, that's associated with Expressionism, this idea of using architecture to generate social cohesion. And in Scharoun, it was with, music in the center, gathering people around music. That's also present, obviously, in Gehry's Disney Hall, and then in TWA, it's a cohesion formed through, and in many of Saarinen's works, but also in many post-war American architects' works generally, it's a community formed through consumption. And what's interesting is, like you're saying, one person's, leveling everyone out and getting rid of individuality is another person's, wonderful symbol of democracy. And so you hear and how people talk about Philharmonie, and I think still do, and I think it is very compelling, this idea that this is the perfect building to visually express and engender a sense of democracy, because unlike other halls that had boxes and tiers, everyone's sort of sitting more on the same level. But then in other places, the very same effect can be interpreted as you say, a negative thing. And that's, I think, part of how this sort of binary discourse worked in the Cold War. In one case, prefabrication, for example, is talked about like this mastery of low-cost mass production of buildings. In another context, prefabrication is talked about as this awful socialist thing that puts everyone in boxes. So again, I think, obviously, all three of these architects are thinking about the users. That's part of what distinguishes their work. They're all thinking about how the forms of their buildings, the aesthetic form, the spatial forms can create these communities. But how that gets interpreted and talked about is different in each case. It's different in each building, and it's different in the 1960s than it is, or early 2000s, that it is now. And then, add to that, in the end, the idea that people now, well, of course, TWA was threatened with being torn down and then given historical preservation status, and now is a hotel. And I can tell you, when I was working on this project, that a lot of people are taking selfies of themselves in the TWA, and that is like part of how people experience and consume architecture. And that's another form of, identification and community building, for better or worse, that I think extends these ideas into the contemporary age.
There's a question here, and then Eva, Inger.
Thank you. I was just wondering whether within your research you are able to also explore the kind of colonial influences on the creation, and then also on the reviews, the colonial patriarchal impact or influences on those.
I haven't gotten there yet, but to me that's part of the continuities I'm looking to sort of reestablish and reconnect, is understanding, for one thing today, I'm interested, often post-war histories of architecture kind of assume that what was happening in Western Europe and the US are just kind of always the same. So I was trying to sort of sketch out that actually there are different discourses happening. I'm also really interested, like I showed Lucas's book, and continuities across the East-West divide. And I think, globally as well. I mean, you could ask questions like, where the building materials are coming from, how the labor operates. I mean, I think I can't reconstitute or uncover all these continuities, but I think that's the kind of thing that hasn't been given its due until relatively recently, and is, really important part of this story of architecture at a moment when it's really starting to become more global in all kinds of ways.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily, for this wonderful talk. I'm not sure if my question leads to anywhere beyond what Mateusz just asked, because I also wanted to ask about the kind of the users of these buildings. And I was really struck by this one quote that you gave about the Philharmonie being this kind of the most democratic space. And I think what interested me was, I mean, it's so important in this phase, like 50s in Germany, to define how democracy can even, or who can participate in a project called democracy, and how, and then to combine it to affect, to emotion. I thought that was really interesting to me, and it's also interesting that you're standing next to this Demokratie durch Kultur stärken poster. But I was wondering how this, I think, quite specific, also German hope or promise of, you know, finding some concept of democratic common sense again somewhere, how that resonates within, you know, other kind of expressionist positions in the US, how that differs then in because they're sorry, that's it.
No, I mean, I think there's a kind of there's a way in which the Philharmonie is interpreted in this regard that is different, I think, than it might have been in the US, where there is this suspicion around. You can have, I don't know if you can somehow have an idealism in West Berlin in the 1950s that was less possible in the US, or was possible, only possible in a different way, because the idea that you would group, you know, like I said, try to sway people by their emotions was considered anathema. At the same time, of course, that's what TV was doing, that's what advertising was doing. So it's like fraught with contradiction. And that's why I think in the US context, this classist, extremely elitist, because the other question is, like, who are these buildings for and who are they imagining are the publics that are in these buildings? And in the US, there's absolutely this very strong sort of elitist, classist, aspect to this question of how buildings, and in the US, it's through consumption, as we've seen. So, but in some ways, I think the Philharmonie is kind of, I don't know if it's an exception, but it just seemed to really clearly convey its idea in a way that really resonated with the public at that time. And I think that has as much to do, it has to do with the architecture, it has to do with the moment, the fact that the border closes as it's being constructed. It has to do with the very canniness of the people who built it. There was a, when you look at the plans for the 1950s in the back, there's a room called the TV room. They're already thinking about broadcasting it to, the rest of Germany. So I would not say, I don't want to say it's unique, but I do think there's something about the Philharmonie that it's sort of like, that its time and place seemed to help in making it such an effective symbol.
Okay, Franz Engel and then Georg Schalbert.
Thank you very much. My question comes back to the question of drawing from scratch and the question of the creative process in creating expressionist architecture and the question whether technology is just taken as a device to express the things which are created in other sections. And as counterexample, one could think of the Centre Pompidou, Richard Rogers now, where there's really something like an expressive technology, so to say, the technology which is the example of which is being expressed somehow.
Sometimes it's called structural expressionism. And if you look it up on Wikipedia, it has the synonym high-tech architecture. So there's this uncanny way in which, in a case like the Centre Pompidou, like this this idea of expressionism, which, you know, in the 60s was thought of as anti-technological, suddenly becomes the most technological thing. But when you thinking about drawing again, I don't know if anyone has heard the probably apocryphal story of how the Russian cosmonauts met at some point with some astronauts from NASA, and the astronauts from NASA were we're telling them about how they invented the pen that you can write with in space, the ballpoint pen, and telling them, all the things they did to develop this pen so that they could write in a gravity-less environment. And the Russian cosmonaut says, we just use pencils, So I think a pencil to me is part of what is technological. I think sometimes when the word technology, especially right now, we think immediately of machine and of digital. But part of what I want to, what I try to challenge myself to do is think of these things in terms of continuities and not these sort of completely discrete, separated out kinds of processes, but processes that are entirely tied together and part of a historical continuity and also a technological continuity. Part of how technology gets invented is because it is designed to automate something, automate something done by hand or by a pencil. And so thinking about those moments where where these things are really tied together and integrated, I think that's what is, potentially really interesting and revealing.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, and I want to I continue a little bit this question, the tension between creativity and technology, and I would like to focus again on the role of the computer. And you were talking a lot about technology. I think it's a very broad term, and the interesting point with computers is maybe calculation, but also the history of architecture can be seen as kind of a history of calculation. So multiplying things, measurements, and so on. And in a large part, it's also a history of disguising calculation. So, and I always saw a little bit particularly Frank Gehry, somebody who is disguising the calculation of his buildings. It looks like squashed alloy boxes or something like that, but far from being calculated at all. So my question would be now, how far would you see the computer as a starting point, or really an instrument of, or how far do you know? Frank Gehry or Saarinen were calling the computer as an instrument of creativity. Did they disguise it rather, or did they promote it as I'm calculating with or doing my creative process with the computer? If you think about Super Studio or others who really made the calculation as a basis of the creative process. But I didn't know about that here, so that would be interesting. And a last question, very concrete one, is: does Frank Gehry use, how do you say, user interfaces, so visual user interfaces, or you can use the computer so and so? That's also a very interesting story. So with graphic interfaces, or are you making really calculations by numbers? So do you know which programs he's using?
Yeah, well, certainly there are the technologies that help in creating digital design files and computation in terms of structural engineering, but there's of course also all of the related programs that architects were using from the 60s on that are about administration and managing large design teams. And or like managing, calculating cost of materials, and if we use this kind of steel, how much will that cost versus this kind of steel? And all of those technologies are very much part of what Frank Gehry uses. What's specific and interesting about him is that when he created his own firm, Gehry Technologies, and so whereas many architects design and then might hand drawings off to, say, a structural engineer, an engineering firm, to translate them into buildable plans or to work out how they're going to be built. For Frank Gehry, it's all done in-house. So to some extent, I would say he would probably agree with you that he is not interested in technology as itself part of the aesthetic in the same way that you're saying like Super Studio would. And when he talks about, for example, there's a book where Greg Lynn is interviewing him about his use of of CATIA early on, and they're talking about architects whose design make it clear that they're using these technologies in the end result, versus for Frank Gehry, he's very adamant that to him, it's, it's a tool. He does not want it to be the driving force of the creativity. He always wants to be in the driver's seat. And I think there are many reasons that Gehry technologies exist and that he takes all of this in-house, but that is perhaps one of them, is because it also has to do, again, with the particular architects and what their processes are and how they work, which can be very radically different. And for him, the visual design and the structural engineering and the management of the process are all part of the same. He views them very much as all part of the same process, and they're all happening in-house in his architecture firm. So that's a really, I think, different role that technology plays, both in terms of the end aesthetic of what he's doing and in terms of his process of how he even designs the building than maybe some other architects who would do a visual design and then hand that off to somebody else. I think there are believe it or not, the only CATIA drawings I've seen are from like 2002. So I don't know what CATIA looks like now compared to what it looked like then, but I'm sure there's a graphical interface that they use to manipulate these things for sure, yeah.
Okay, I think we will have a big round of applause to thank Emily Pugh for this incredible lecture. And we really enjoyed it and learned so much. And there are drinks and a reception upstairs. Maybe you can direct everyone.
Ja, ich wiederhole nochmal unser Angebot, die Unterhaltung und die Diskussion fortzusetzen. Und zwar, wenn Sie die Treppe ein Stockwerk höher gehen, haben wir etwas bereitgestellt und würden uns freuen, Sie da begrüßen zu dürfen.